Montana, February 1973. While most builders in Flathead County were repeating the same mistakes, thin-walled cabins that bled heat, basements that turned into ice cellars, metal structures that wept condensation until everything rotted, one man was being called reckless. The most experienced builder in the county looked at his plans and said it flat. That's a death trap. But what if the worst idea in construction history was actually the smartest thing anyone had done in that valley? Picture this. A curved steel shell sitting on top of a stone basement, looking more like a military bunker than a home. Neighbors driving past, shaking their heads. Local contractors placing bets on how long before the whole thing failed. And one man, working alone most days, betting everything he had on a design that combined two methods everyone said would never work together. Stone basements were old news. Everyone knew they turned cold and stayed cold. Metal Quonset huts were cheap surplus, sure, but nobody lived in them for a reason. Condensation turned them into dripping nightmares. Put them together? That wasn't innovation. That was asking for trouble. At least, that's what they said. Until the coldest winter in a decade proved every single one of them wrong. Today, you're going to understand exactly why a design that got laughed out of the lumber yard became the most copied home in 50 miles. And by the end, you'll see the one number that made every critic go silent. If you want a real frontier technique every week, methods that worked when life actually depended on it, hit subscribe right now. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because what happened in that Montana winter changes how you think about heating forever. Let's go back to where it started. His name was Ray Hutchins, carpenter by trade, welder by necessity, and stubborn by reputation. Ray had spent 3 winters watching his neighbors burn through cords of firewood just to keep their homes barely livable. The standard approach in Flathead County was simple. Build a wood frame house, insulate it the best you could afford, install a wood stove, and feed it constantly. By February, families were burning 16-hour days just to maintain 50 degrees inside. The basements were worse. Stone foundations that everyone trusted turned into cold sinks. Massive thermal drains that sucked heat downward faster than any stove could replace it. Concrete poured thin. No thermal break between the ground and the living space. Heat bills that consumed half a family's winter income. And then there were the metal structures. Surplus Quonset huts, those curved, half-cylinder military shelters, were cheap and available after the war. But builders avoided them for homes. The reason was always the same: metal sweats. Condensation formed on the inside skin, dripped onto everything: rotted wood, rusted tools, turned living spaces into cold, wet misery. Ray saw it differently. He wasn't some outsider with fancy ideas from the city. He'd grown up in Montana, spent 15 years framing houses, another 5 welding grain silos and barn structures. He understood wood. He understood metal. And he understood something most builders were too proud to admit. The traditional methods everyone swore by weren't actually working that well. He'd been inside those properly built log homes during January cold snaps, seen families huddled within 6 feet of the stove because anywhere farther and you could see your breath. Watch people wake up every 3 hours to feed the fire because letting it die meant waking up to a 40-degree house. Heard the complaints about wood consumption, how a family could go through 4, 5, even 6 cords in a single winter and still freeze half the time. Ray had also worked on enough metal structures to know the condensation problem wasn't the metal itself. It was the lack of proper insulation and vapor control. A Quonset hut used as an uninsulated storage shed? Of course it sweated, but insulate it correctly, manage the moisture, and that curved steel shell became one of the most efficient shapes you could build. No thermal bridging through studs. No complicated roof trusses losing heat. Just a continuous arch that shed snow and wind like nothing else. And the stone basement issue? That was even simpler. People were building them wrong. Thin walls, direct contact with frozen ground, no thermal mass to speak of. But if you went deep enough, thick enough, and understood how earth shelter construction actually worked, stone became your ally. The ground 8 feet down didn't freeze. It stayed stable, 48 to 52 degrees year-round in Montana. That was free baseline heat if you knew how to capture it. He'd worked on enough job sites to understand something most people missed. The problem wasn't the materials. It was how they were used. Stone wasn't the enemy of heat. It was the solution if you gave it enough mass. Metal wasn't a condensation trap. It was an efficient shell if you insulated it right and controlled the airflow. So in the fall of 1972, Ray made a decision that would get him called crazy for the next 4 months. He was going to build a Quonset hut, a 24-foot wide arched steel shell, directly over a stone basement. Not a thin foundation. A full 8-foot deep cellar, walls made of local sandstone, 2 feet thick, dug down into the earth where the temperature stayed stable year-round. 2 levels. Stone below, steel above. Old and new. Mass and efficiency. When word got out, the reactions were immediate. You're going to freeze and drown at the same time. That metal's going to sweat so bad you'll need a sump pump in your bedroom. Stone basement? You just built yourself an icebox with a fancy lid. Ray didn't argue. He just kept working. Here's what Ray actually built, and why it made people so uncomfortable. The basement came first. He dug 8 feet down into stable ground, then lined the walls with sandstone blocks, each one averaging 40 pounds. The walls were 2 feet thick. That meant roughly 4,000 pounds of stone per linear foot of wall. He left the floor as compacted earth. No concrete slab to act as a thermal conductor. The dirt stayed at a consistent 48 to 52 degrees year-round, insulated by the earth itself. He installed small windows on the south side of the stone basement, just enough to let in winter sun during the low-angle months. He built a wood-fired masonry heater in the center of the basement, designed to radiate warmth slowly over 18 to 20 hours. The stone walls would absorb that heat, hold it, and release it gradually. Thermal mass at work. The masonry heater itself was critical. Ray didn't install a standard metal wood stove. Those burned hot and fast, releasing most of their heat up the chimney. Instead, he built a Finnish-style contra-masonry heater, using firebrick and a serpentine flue path that forced hot gases to travel through multiple channels before exiting. This captured 70 to 80% of the heat from combustion, radiating it slowly into the stone basement over the entire day. The mass of the heater alone, roughly 2,000 pounds of brick, acted as another thermal battery. Fire it once in the morning, and it stayed warm to the touch until the next morning. Combined with the 4,000 pounds of stone per wall section, Ray had created an underground thermal reservoir. The earth protected it from external temperature swings. The stone absorbed and held the heat. The whole system worked like a massive, slow-release radiator. But here's the detail most people missed. Ray wasn't trying to heat the basement to 70 degrees. He was charging it to 60 to 65 degrees. Just warm enough to radiate steady heat upward into the living space above, but not so hot that it wasted energy. This is where the 2-level design became essential. Then came the Quonset. Ray purchased a surplus military Quonset kit, prefabricated arched steel ribs with corrugated metal skin. He assembled it directly on top of the stone basement walls, sealing the connection with a continuous rubber gasket and treated with sill plate. The Quonset formed the upper living level, sleeping area, kitchen, seating. 16 feet wide inside, 24 feet long, with a ceiling height of 10 feet at the center arch. But here's the part that made builders furious. He insulated the interior of the Quonset with 6 inches of fiberglass bats, then covered it with a vapor barrier and tongue and groove pine paneling. He added 2 large skylights at the top of the arch to capture solar heat during the day. He installed operable vents at both gable ends to control airflow and prevent moisture buildup. The vapor barrier was placed on the warm side of the insulation, critical for preventing moisture from reaching the cold metal skin. He caulked every seam. He created a continuous air barrier. This wasn't guesswork. It was deliberate moisture management. The operable vents allowed him to exhaust humid air from cooking and bathing before it could condense anywhere. The skylights served a dual purpose. During winter, when the sun sat low on the southern horizon, those south-facing skylights captured direct solar radiation even on cold days. The sun would heat the interior air, which naturally rose to the peak of the arch, then circulated down as it cooled. Free heat. During summer, Ray could open the vents and skylights to create cross-ventilation, exhausting hot air and pulling cooler air up from the shaded stone basement below. The science was sound. The stone basement acted as a thermal battery, absorbing heat from the masonry stove and the Earth's stable temperature, then radiating it upward into the Quonset. The insulated metal shell held that warmth in, prevented heat loss through the roof, and reflected radiant energy back down. The two-level design created natural thermal stratification. Warm air rising into the living space, cool air sinking into the basement where it would be reheated by the stone mass. He even built the exterior stone staircase with an air gap between the steps and the basement wall, a deliberate thermal break to prevent cold transfer. Ray explained all of this to a few people. Most didn't listen. The experienced builders saw risk everywhere. Metal condensates, they said. You need wood framing to breathe. They worried about structural load, whether the stone walls could support the Quonset's weight during snow loads. They questioned the cost. You could have built a normal house for half that. The local contractors were blunter. One man, a respected stone mason named Victor Carroll, stood outside the site one afternoon in November and said it loud enough for the whole crew to hear. That stone basement's going to bleed heat faster than you can make it. And when that metal starts sweating, you'll be sleeping in a dripping cave. Victor had built stone foundations for 30 years. He knew stone went cold and stayed cold. Everyone knew that. The idea that you could turn a stone basement into a heat source seemed backward. Stone pulled heat out of buildings. That was just physics as far as he was concerned. But Victor was thinking about thin stone walls in direct contact with frozen ground. He wasn't thinking about 2-foot-thick walls insulated from the outside by 8 feet of earth, charged daily by a high-mass masonry heater. That was a different system entirely. Ray tried to explain the difference. Victor walked away. People didn't just doubt the engineering. They doubted the idea of a home that didn't look like a home. That's not a house, someone muttered at the hardware store. It's a bunker with a barn on top. Ray kept working. He knew something they didn't. He knew that thermal mass doesn't bleed heat when it's insulated from the outside and charged from the inside. He knew that metal doesn't condensate when you control the vapor barrier and allow proper ventilation. He knew that a low-profile structure with a curved roof sheds wind and snow better than a peaked frame. But none of that would matter until winter came. By December, Ray had moved in. The Quonset was finished. The basement stove was installed. The stone walls had been absorbing ambient warmth for weeks. And the criticism got sharper. Victor Carroll wasn't just skeptical anymore. He was vocal. He told people at the diner that Ray had built a liability. He said the stone would act like a heat sink, pulling warmth out of the living space and dumping it into the frozen ground. He said the metal shell would create interior frost on cold nights. That moisture would accumulate between the insulation and the paneling, that the whole structure would become unlivable by February. Another builder, a framing contractor named Gil Sanderson, was even harsher. He'd seen Quonset huts used as storage sheds and equipment garages, and he'd seen the condensation problem firsthand. You put people in there, he said, and their breath, their cooking, their body heat, it's all going to condensate on that cold metal. You'll wake up with ice on the inside of your ceiling. Gil had worked construction for 22 years. He'd framed houses through brutal winters, seen what worked and what failed. And in his experience, metal buildings were for equipment, not people. He'd walked through unheated Quonsets in January and seen frost thick as a finger coating the interior ribs, drip lines running down to puddles on the floor, the whole inside shell wet and freezing. The idea that you could live in one, sleep in one, raise a family in one, struck him as reckless. Even with insulation, he told a group at the lumber yard, you're still sleeping under a frozen metal roof. That's not a home. That's a gamble. And it wasn't just the Quonset that had people worried. The stone basement bothered them even more. Victor Carroll kept hammering on this point. Stone, in his view, was the problem. I've built foundations for 30 years, he said, and I can tell you, stone goes cold in winter and stays cold. You don't heat stone. Stone heats nothing. He'd seen it in every basement he'd ever worked on. Cold stone walls, cold stone floors. Families avoiding their basements from November to March because it felt like walking into a refrigerator. The notion that Ray's basement would somehow generate heat, store it, and radiate it upward seemed like wishful thinking. It wasn't just professionals. Neighbors weighed in. One family that had lived in the valley for 30 years said it plain, "A real man builds a log house and keeps the fire going. That thing? That's hiding from winter." There was a cultural dimension to the criticism that went beyond engineering. In Flathead County, your home said something about you. A log cabin meant you respected tradition, understood hard work, and weren't afraid of the elements. You faced winter head-on. You fed the fire. You endured. But a curved metal hut half buried in the ground? That looked like retreat, like someone trying to avoid the struggle instead of meeting it. People didn't say it outright, but the sentiment was there. If you weren't willing to wake up every few hours to feed a fire, you didn't belong in Montana. Ray didn't respond. He just lit his masonry stove once a day, let the basement warm up, and watched the system work. Then January hit. It started the second week. Temperatures dropped to -15 Fahrenheit overnight. By mid-month, it was -22. A cold front stalled over western Montana, and for 11 straight days, the thermometer didn't break zero. Daytime highs hovered between -5 and -10. Across Flathead County, families were in survival mode. Neighbors were burning firewood around the clock, loading stoves every 4 hours, waking up at 2 a.m. to keep coals alive. Houses that normally held 55 degrees were struggling to stay above 45. Basements turned into freezers. Pipes burst in crawl spaces. People started sleeping in their living rooms, as close to the stove as they could get, piling on wool blankets and down bags. One family, the Callahans, burned through a full cord of split pine in 5 days. They had 3 young kids and couldn't risk letting the fire die overnight. Jim Callahan was setting his alarm for every 3 hours just to reload the stove. By the end of the first week, he looked like he hadn't slept in a month. Another neighbor, an older couple named the Haverfords, gave up trying to heat their whole house. They closed off the bedrooms, sealed the doors with blankets, and lived in the kitchen and front room. Even then, the temperature hovered in the mid-40s. They wore coats indoors, slept in insulated coveralls. Heating bills spiked. One family burned through 3 full cords of firewood in 2 weeks. Would they plan to stretch until March? And then the blizzard came. February 6th. A low-pressure system dumped 22 inches of snow in 36 hours. Winds gusted to 40 miles per hour. The temperature dropped to -30 Fahrenheit. The county lost power in some areas. Roads closed. For 3 full days, people were on their own. The blizzard didn't just bring snow. It brought wind. Sustained winds at 25 to 35 miles per hour, gusts over 40. That kind of wind doesn't just make it feel colder. It strips heat off structures. It finds every crack, every gap, every weak point in a building envelope and pulls warmth out. Wood frame houses groaned under the load. Snow piled 4 feet high against north walls. Drafts came through window frames, door jambs, electrical outlets. Families stuffed towels under doors and taped plastic over windows just to slow the heat loss. And the cold, -30 Fahrenheit, is a different kind of cold. It's the kind that makes your lungs ache when you breathe. That turns engine oil to sludge. That splits green firewood when you try to burn it because the moisture inside freezes and expands faster than the wood can release it. This was the test. Stay with me, because what happened next humiliated every person who said Ray's design was a death trap. Victor Carroll stopped by on the 3rd day of the blizzard. Not to help, to see if Ray had frozen out yet. He knocked on the exterior stone staircase door, expecting to find Ray huddled by a roaring fire, burning wood as fast as everyone else. Instead, Ray opened the door in a t-shirt. The interior temperature of the Quonset home was 71 degrees Fahrenheit. Victor stood there, snow piling onto his shoulders, wind cutting across the open valley at -30, and stared. "How much wood are you burning?" Victor asked. Ray smiled. "I fired the stove yesterday morning. Haven't touched it since." That wasn't possible. Not in this cold. Not with this wind. Victor's own house, a well-built log structure with 6 inches of fiberglass insulation and a modern barrel stove, was sitting at 48 degrees despite burning wood every 4 hours. His wife had called him that morning asking if they should go stay with family in town. The stove was running full blast, and they still couldn't get the house above 50. But here was Ray, 36 hours after his last fire, standing in shirt sleeves in a metal building everyone said would be an icebox. Victor asked to come inside. Ray stepped aside, but it was true. Here's what was actually happening inside Ray's home, and the numbers don't lie. The stone basement, with its 4,000 pounds of sandstone per linear wall foot, had been absorbing heat from the masonry stove for 2 months. By the time the blizzard hit, those walls were fully charged, radiating steady warmth at around 62 to 65 degrees. The earth floor, insulated by 8 feet of ground, stayed at a stable 50 degrees. When Ray fired the masonry heater once a day, the stone absorbed the heat and released it over the next 18 to 20 hours. The warm air naturally rose through the open staircase into the Quonset living area above. The insulated metal shell, 6 inches of fiberglass plus vapor barrier, held that warmth inside. The curved roof shed wind and snow. The skylights, double-paned and south-facing, captured solar radiation even on overcast days, adding passive heat during the brief daylight hours. The masonry heater's design was key here. Unlike a metal stove that released most of its heat immediately and sent the rest up the chimney, Ray's finished contra-masonry heater captured 70 to 80% of the combustion heat in its brick mass. That 2,000-pound thermal battery radiated warmth for a full day. Combined with the stone walls, Ray had created a heat storage system that didn't depend on continuous fire. Think about what that means. Most wood stoves operate on the principle of active heating. Burn wood, create heat, lose most of it up the flue, repeat every few hours. Ray's system operated on stored heat. Burn once, capture the energy in thermal mass, release it slowly over 24 hours. It was the difference between a sprinter and a marathon runner. Same total energy output, completely different delivery method. And the stone basement wasn't just storing heat from the fire. It was also benefiting from the stable ground temperature. 8 feet down, the earth in Montana stays between 48 and 52 degrees year-round. That's not warm enough to heat a house on its own, but it's a massive advantage when outside air is -30. The stone walls weren't losing heat to frozen ground. They were insulated from it by 8 feet of earth. They only interfaced with stable, moderate temperatures below and heated air above. The result? Thermal stability. While his neighbors were burning 16 hours a day just to maintain 45 degrees, Ray's home stayed between 68 and 72 degrees with 1 firing per day. Sometimes he skipped a day entirely, and the temperature only dropped to 65. Let's compare that to the standard homes in the area. A typical wood frame house, 1,500 square feet, insulated with 3 inches of fiberglass, burning a modern wood stove continuously during the cold snap. Internal temperature ranged from 42 to 55 degrees. Wood consumption, 1.5 cords over 2 weeks. Ray's Quonset over stone home, roughly 900 square feet of combined living space. Internal temperature ranged from 65 to 72 degrees. Wood consumption, 1/3 of a cord over the same 2 weeks. That's 65% less wood. For a warmer home, the Callahans, Ray's nearest neighbors, kept detailed records that winter because they were trying to figure out their fuel budget. Over the 14-day cold snap, they burned 1.4 cords of seasoned Douglas fir. Their average indoor temperature was 49 degrees. They reloaded the stove every 3 to 4 hours, day and night. Ray used 0.4 cords over the same period. His average indoor temperature was 69 degrees. He fired the masonry heater once every 24 hours, sometimes once every 36. The Haverfords, the older couple down the road, had given up heating their whole house. They sealed off 2/3 of it and focused on keeping the kitchen livable. Even in that reduced space, they burned through 0.9 cords in 2 weeks and stayed in the mid-40s. But the number that made everyone stop talking? During the blizzard, when external temperatures hit -30 Fahrenheit and neighbors' homes dropped into the low 40s despite constant fires, Ray's home never fell below 65 degrees. The delta, the difference between outside and inside, was 95 degrees. His unheated neighbors, the ones who'd let their fires go out overnight to save wood, their homes dropped to 10 degrees inside. Ray's home, on a single firing 24 hours earlier, stayed 55 degrees warmer than theirs. 55 degrees warmer. In the worst cold Flathead County had seen in a decade. Victor walked down into the stone basement that afternoon. He wanted to see the source of the heat for himself. The masonry heater was warm to the touch, but not hot. You could rest your hand on it comfortably. The stone walls radiated gentle warmth. Not blazing heat, just steady, even warmth. Like standing near a person, not a fire. He touched the walls. Warm. He looked at the earth floor, dry, stable. He checked the ceiling where the Quonset met the stone. No condensation, no frost, no moisture. Just dry wood and warm air rising naturally into the living space above. The stone basement wasn't bleeding heat. It was storing it. The metal shell wasn't condensating. It was insulated correctly, ventilated properly, and performing exactly as Ray had designed. Victor Carroll walked through the Quonset that day. He touched the stone walls in the basement, warm to the hand. He looked at the ceiling, dry, no frost, no dripping. He stood in the middle of the living area and felt the even, radiant warmth rising from below. He didn't apologize, but he stopped talking. Word spread faster than the cold front had moved in. By the time the roads cleared in mid-February, Ray's Quonset home had become the most talked-about structure in Flathead County. It started with Victor Carroll. The day after he visited Ray's home during the blizzard, Victor stopped by the diner where contractors gathered for breakfast. He didn't say much at first, just ordered coffee, sat at the counter, and listened to the usual complaints about frozen pipes, wood consumption, and families barely making it through the cold snap. Then someone asked him directly, "You seen Ray's place lately? That metal trap hold up?" Victor set down his coffee. "It's 70 degrees in there. He's burning a third of what we are, and the stone basement is warm." The table went quiet. Gil Sanderson, the framing contractor who'd been one of Ray's harshest critics, leaned forward. "Warm? Stone doesn't stay warm. Not in February." Victor looked at him. "Go see for yourself." And people did. Over the next 2 weeks, Ray had a steady stream of visitors. Contractors who wanted to see the masonry heater. Neighbors who wanted to touch the stone walls. Families who were exhausted from feeding fires every 4 hours and wanted to know if there was another way. Ray walked them through the system. He explained the thermal mass principle, how stone absorbs heat slowly and releases it even slower, creating a stable reservoir that doesn't spike and crash like a metal stove. He showed them the masonry heater's serpentine flue path, the thick firebrick core, the way it captured combustion heat instead of sending it up the chimney. He demonstrated the vapor barrier in the Quonset, the ventilation system, the deliberate air gaps, and thermal breaks. Some people understood immediately. Others needed to stand in the basement for 10 minutes, feeling the radiant warmth coming off 2-foot-thick stone walls before it clicked. One of the first to act was a young carpenter named Ben Rucker. He'd been struggling to heat a small cabin he'd built the previous summer. Standard wood frame, thin insulation, metal stove. He was burning 2 cords a month and barely staying comfortable. After visiting Ray's home, he spent 3 days sketching plans. Ben didn't have the budget for a full Quonset kit, but he understood the principle. He dug a partial basement, 5 feet deep instead of 8, and built stone walls on the north and west sides where the wind hit hardest. He insulated the exterior of the stone with straw bales, then backfilled with earth. He kept his wood frame cabin above, but added a small masonry heater in the partial basement. The next winter, his wood consumption dropped by half, and his indoor temperature stabilized 15 degrees higher than the previous year. Word of Ben's success spread. Other builders started adapting the concept. A family named the Pritchards built a stone-walled root cellar beneath their existing home, then cut a vent from the cellar into their living room floor. They installed a small masonry heater in the cellar. The stone walls absorbed heat from the heater and the stable earth temperature, radiating warmth upward into the house. They didn't get Ray's dramatic results. Their house was already built and retrofitting had limits. But they cut their wood use by 30% and added 20 degrees to their basement, which they'd previously abandoned every winter. Victor Carroll, the mason who'd criticized Ray most publicly, took the longest to come around. But by late March, he was quietly visiting Ray's home again, this time with a notebook. He asked about wall thickness, stone selection, mortar mixes, insulation strategies. He didn't announce he was changing his methods. He just started building different basements. The next fall, Victor was contracted to build a foundation for a new home outside Kalispell. Instead of the standard 8-inch poured concrete wall, he proposed a hybrid design. 12-inch stone walls on the north side, insulated on the exterior with a small masonry heater alcove built into the foundation plan. The homeowner was skeptical but trusted Victor's experience. By the following winter, that home was outperforming every comparable house in the area. Victor's reputation shifted. He went from traditional mason to the guy who builds warm basements. Within 3 years, 12 variations of Ray's design had been built within a 50-mile radius of his original home. Some were full Quonset over stone builds like Ray's. Others were partial earth shelter designs with stone thermal mass on one or two sides. A few were retrofits, existing homes with stone cellars added beneath or behind them, linked by vents or open stairwells. The designs varied, but the principle was the same. Use stone as a thermal battery, insulate it from the outside, charge it with a high-efficiency heat source, and let it radiate warmth slowly over time. The local lumber yard in Columbia Falls started stocking Quonset kits by 1975. They sold 6 that first year. The owner, a man named Frank DeLorean, told people he'd never thought of Quonsets as residential structures until Ray proved otherwise. Turns out, Frank said, the military knew something about efficiency we'd been ignoring. Stone masons in the region began advertising thermal mass construction as a specialty service. They didn't always understand the full science, but they'd seen the results. They knew that thick stone walls, properly insulated and integrated with a home's heating system, could cut fuel costs and improve comfort. That was enough. Even Gil Sanderson, the contractor who'd predicted condensation disasters, changed his tune. In 1976, he built a shop building for his carpentry business using a similar concept: metal arch structure over a shallow stone-walled basement. He didn't call it Quonset. He called it a thermal-efficient workshop. But anyone who looked at it knew where the idea came from. The cultural shift was subtle but real. In 1972, building a home that didn't look like a traditional cabin or ranch house was seen as strange, maybe even cowardly, avoiding winter instead of facing it. By 1976, it was seen as smart, practical, the kind of thing a man did when he understood his environment and refused to waste resources. Ray didn't become famous. He didn't start a business or sell plans. He just lived in his home, heated it with one fire a day, and answered questions when people asked. But the impact was undeniable. A design that had been called a death trap became a reference point. The worst idea in Flathead County became proof that old knowledge, thermal mass, earth sheltering, radiant heat, could be combined with new materials to create something better than either approach alone. Here's what Ray understood that most people missed. Innovation isn't always about inventing something new. Sometimes it's about combining things that already work, things people have forgotten or dismissed, and letting them do what they were always capable of doing. Stone has been storing heat for thousands of years. Humans have been building with it since before recorded history. The Romans used hypocaust systems, heated floors and walls that radiated warmth for hours after the fire died. Finnish and Russian cultures developed masonry heaters that could warm a home for a full day on a single firing. Indigenous peoples across the northern hemisphere built earth-sheltered homes that stayed warm in winter and cool in summer by interfacing with stable ground temperatures. Ray didn't invent any of that. He just remembered it. And then he combined it with a modern material, a surplus military shelter design for efficiency and durability, and made it work in 1970s Montana. The lesson isn't that everyone should build a Quonset hut over a stone basement. The lesson is that the principles Ray used, thermal mass, proper insulation, earth sheltering, high-efficiency heat sources, passive solar gain, are universal. They work. They've always worked. We just stopped paying attention. In a world where heating costs were rising, where energy was becoming expensive, where people were burning more resources to stay less comfortable. Ray built a home that did the opposite. Less fuel, more warmth, stable temperatures, practical results. That's not stubbornness. That's engineering. The winter of 1973 didn't just test Ray's home. It tested an assumption that modern construction methods were automatically better than old ones, that progress meant abandoning thermal mass and earth sheltering in favor of lightweight framing and active heating systems. Ray proved the assumption wrong, not with theory, with a thermometer. 55 degrees warmer, one-third the wood, 70-degree comfort in a -30 blizzard. Those numbers didn't lie, and they didn't need explanation. They were the answer. Now it's your turn. Which part of this solution would you apply to your home today? The thermal mass basement? The efficient masonry heater? The earth shelter design? The insulated metal shell? Drop a comment with your location and the coldest winter you've ever faced. Let's see how many of us are still trying to fight winter the hard way, when there's a smarter path forward. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. Every week, I bring you one real frontier technique that worked when life depended on it. No theory, no guesswork, just methods that stood the test of time and the coldest winters North America could throw at them. See you in the next one. Educational note. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictional, while the techniques, concepts, and principles discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical or practical knowledge. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current standards, safety guidelines, and applicable laws or regulations. This content is educational in nature and does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.